had been counting the days, imagining the quiet air of the mountain lodge filling my lungs, the way the pine scent would wash over me and erase months of stress and deadlines. I parked at the familiar gravel driveway, expecting the solitude I had been craving, my mind already picturing evenings by the fireplace, with only the wind outside for company. But the moment I stepped out of the car, my heart slammed into my chest. Laughter, loud, intrusive laughter, echoed from the porch, and through the open windows I saw them. My sister, her husband, and his entire family were sprawled across my living room, unpacking, laughing, and making themselves at home as if this place had always belonged to them. I froze, disbelief rooting me to the spot. This was my retreat, my sanctuary, and suddenly it had been invaded. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to walk up the steps, each one heavier than the last. Their heads turned toward me, surprise flickering briefly before smug amusement replaced it. My sister's smile felt sharp, like a blade disguised as warmth, and her husband's confident posture only fueled the fire rising inside me. Humiliation surged, twisting my stomach into knots. How could they do this? I had come here to heal, to breathe, and instead I felt cornered in my own home, an unwelcome outsider. I tried to find words, but none came immediately, just a mixture of shock and rising anger. Every familiar corner of the lodge now felt alien, tainted by their presence, by their audacity. I clenched my fists at my sides, my mind racing with questions and simmering outrage. This wasn't just an intrusion, it was a declaration, a blatant disregard for boundaries, for family respect, for me. I forced a shaky breath and reminded myself that I would not let this moment define the rest of my stay. But inside, I knew the emotional battle had already begun, and the lodge I had loved so dearly would no longer be my sanctuary without a fight. I stepped inside, forcing my voice to remain steady even as my chest burned with indignation. "What are you all doing here?" I asked, trying to keep the edge from spilling into panic. My sister glanced up from where she was arranging a vase on the mantel, her expression carefully casual, as if she'd expected me to ask but already had an answer rehearsed. "We thought we'd stay for a while," she said lightly, almost too light, like a playful joke. "We didn't think you'd mind." I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and tight. "Your idea of a while is taking over my entire home. Do you realize this is my lodge? I've been paying for it, maintaining it. It belongs to me." Her husband leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, smirking like the world itself was on their side. "Oh, come on," he said, voice smooth and condescending. "We're just guests." "You're being dramatic." My stomach twisted as disbelief collided with fury. Guests? They were treating my sanctuary as their living room, unpacking, leaving their clutter, laughing as if I weren't even there. My sister added, almost sweetly, "You always make a big deal out of nothing. Just relax. We're family." But family didn't trample over ownership, didn't erase boundaries, didn't disrespect someone this way. I felt the betrayal like a slap, a weight pressing on my shoulders, and the words stuck in my throat. How could she side with them so easily, dismiss my rights, my history with this place, my need for peace? I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, every corner of the lodge suddenly a stage for their arrogance. They smiled and joked, oblivious or indifferent to the storm rising in me, and I realized that confrontation alone would not be enough. This was bigger than words. It was a challenge, a test of wills, and I was not going to back down. Not now, not ever. As I sank into the armchair, the lodge around me fading into the background, memories I had tried to bury resurfaced with sharp clarity. I remembered holidays where my achievements were dismissed while my sisters were celebrated endlessly, the invisible scale of favoritism tipping against me year after year. Birthdays passed with forgotten gifts or last-minute phone calls, while she received extravagant surprises and endless praise. I recalled my efforts to help family members, sacrifices I made that went unnoticed, while she basked in attention and approval. Even as children, I had learned that my voice didn't carry the same weight, that my worth was measured against her, and I always came up short. Those early experiences had planted seeds of resentment, but also a quiet determination to prove myself, to demand respect I had never been given. Sitting here now, watching her stride confidently through my home, Those old wounds throbbed with renewed intensity. I understood why my anger flared so easily, why humiliation cut so deeply. This wasn't just about the lodge. It was about decades of neglect, of favoritism, of being overlooked in every corner of family life. Every insult, every dismissal, every slight added layers to the fire already burning inside me. The lodge had been my escape, my attempt to claim something solely for myself, a place where I could finally exist without comparison or judgment, and now it had been invaded by the very person who embodied the lifelong imbalance, magnifying every past slight into a raw, unrelenting ache. I closed my eyes, letting the memories settle like smoke around me, fueling a mix of sorrow, rage, and determination that I knew would guide every decision I made from this moment forward. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain calm despite the storm raging inside. "Look, I'm willing to work something out," I began, trying to sound reasonable, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. "If you need a place to stay for a few days, we can arrange it. But this is my home. You can't just move in uninvited." My sister tilted her head, that infuriatingly sweet smile still plastered on her face, and her husband laughed softly, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," he said. "We're family. You know we wouldn't just take advantage." My stomach nodded. Their words weren't apologies. They were manipulation, wrapped in smiles and excuses. I wanted to scream, to shake them until they recognized the audacity of what they'd done, but I forced myself to stay composed, if only for a moment of dignity. I tried again. "Even a temporary stay should be asked, not assumed. You can't just claim my property because you feel entitled." Their eyes flicked toward each other, a silent pact of superiority that left me feeling small, disregarded, and enraged. I wanted them to see the injustice, the blatant disrespect, but instead their smugness only intensified. My mind raced, spinning through every memory of favoritism, betrayal, and long-simmering resentment. How had it come to this? How had the person I grew up with, the one I trusted implicitly, become the embodiment of everything I had fought against? I clenched my fists under the table, trying to ground myself, reminding myself that outrage alone wasn't enough. I needed strategy, observation, patience. Their laughter and casual dismissal stung like salt in an open wound, but I couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I would not lose this battle on the first encounter. I had been overlooked, underestimated, and silenced for too long. This time, I would turn every ounce of their arrogance against them, and they wouldn't even know it was coming. I told myself the first step was to breathe, to stop reacting long enough to see them clearly. So I sat at the kitchen table with a mug I'd bought years ago, pretending to sip and taking notes in my head instead of confronting them again. From that small vantage point, I started to map their movements the way a detective might. Who woke up earliest, who raided the pantry without thinking, who left shoes piled by the back door. Observation felt like the only honest power I had at the moment. They were loud in predictable ways. My sister was the early riser, primping by the window and flitting about with a nervous energy that left traces: lipstick on the counter, a tossed scarf, a planner with appointments she never kept. Her husband moved with deliberate confidence, always checking his messages, always arranging chairs like a man marking territory. The kids, a whirl of sticky fingers and sharp shrieks, left toys underfoot, and a chaotic trail that meant they never noticed anything important. Even the in-laws carried themselves with a performative generosity that felt calculated. I started taking mental inventory. Their habits produced clutter I could exploit later. Unlocked phones, unpaid bills in plain sight, boxes with return labels, a stack of invitations to gatherings they planned to host in my house. They had a tendency to leave doors ajar at odd hours, and to prop open the shed where I stored old paperwork. Once, while passing the study, I watched my sister drop a bank statement on the desk and walk away humming. I inhaled sharply but didn't move. Not yet. Observation turned into documentation. I began to keep a running list in my head of names, dates, and small inconsistencies in their stories. They claimed to be just visiting, yet there were printed schedules for an extended stay, a tourist brochure with checkout dates that didn't match their intentions, and a delivery schedule addressed to my sister at my lodge. The more I noticed, The more their entitlement looked less like accident and more like premeditation. There were emotional weaknesses, too. My sister adored approval. She curated every comment on her social posts and flinched when contradicted. Her husband, despite the bluster, was insecure about status. He loved being recognized as the one who made it. Their in-laws were performative, needing applause at every gathering, and their children were fragile, clinging to whoever offered attention. All of these things were vulnerabilities I could predictably nudge without ever showing my hand. The most important discovery was my own restraint. I could feel anger coiled like a spring, but watching them gave me patience. I realized that force would only escalate things before I had evidence or leverage. Silence, in this case, could be a weapon. Quiet observation would buy me time to gather what I needed: records, witnesses, and the right moment to reveal what they took for granted. By nightfall, I had assembled a plan that was mostly mental, a list of small, controllable moves that would unsettle their complacency and expose their narrative as false. It was not vindictive for the sake of cruelty. It was strategy born of hurt and the necessity to reclaim what was mine. I poured the cooling tea down the sink, set the mug in the dishwasher, and went to bed with my mind humming like the lodge itself. Awake and plotting for now, I started small because small felt safer and frankly more poetic. The first morning after my reconnaissance, I woke before them and quietly logged into the booking platform, where I'd reserved the lodge's extra cabin for guests. I changed the reservation date so that the cabin showed as unavailable for the next 2 weeks. When my sister's teenager complained that there was no space for a sleepover, they blamed bad luck and rolled their eyes. But I heard the shift in tone, the first fissure in their assumed dominance. It was a tiny, almost laughable victory, and I let myself feel it. Next, I rerouted a large furniture delivery that was scheduled to arrive that afternoon. The delivery confirmation had their name on it, a careless overstep, and it amused me that they had used my address for purchases without asking. I called the company with the kind of polite firmness I reserve for utility disputes, and arranged for the shipment to be held at a nearby depot pending authorization. When the driver finally knocked, the look on my sister's face was a mix of irritation and that sudden, uncomfortable awareness that someone else was in control. Her husband tried to mask it with a joke. His voice sounded thin. I also took advantage of their reliance on modern convenience. I contacted the streaming service linked to the TV and changed the account password, temporarily locking them out of the curated playlists and shows they adored. Entertainment, I realized, was part of their claim to comfort. The ability to binge a show together, to post staged photos of laughter by the fireplace. Denied that small spectacle, their smugness dimmed, replaced by restless, petty bickering about whose fault it was. I kept my distance and listened, cataloging every defeated excuse as evidence. Some moves were psychological. I left framed photos, old family portraits I kept in a box, carefully displayed in the hallway where they could be seen. In one, our parents looked proud, eyes fixed on my sister the way they always had been. In another, a younger me stood with a paper crown from a school play, absent from later celebratory displays. I made sure the photos were slightly askew, a subtle visual interruption that might plant a seed of doubt in the mind of anyone who considered themselves the permanent favorite. The aim was not cruelty but truth, small reminders that history was not as tidy as they assumed. I intercepted a string of invitations. They planned to send from the lodge for a so-called family welcome weekend. I edited one event description to accidentally drop a line about extended stay arrangements and altered another to include a tentative checkout date. Then I printed the altered schedules and left them casually on the kitchen island. The next morning, a heated discussion erupted about logistics and conflicting plans. Their perfectly choreographed entitlements started to unravel under the weight of contradictory paperwork. None of these actions were dramatic or illegal. They were strategic irritants, calibrated to unbalance rather than destroy. Each inconvenience exposed the fragility under their bravado, the way their confidence relied on seamless service and unquestioned assumption. Watching them scramble, hearing the tight, clipped tones replace laughter, fed a restrained satisfaction inside me that felt profoundly different from fleeting triumph. This was settling a ledger, not inflicting pain for its own sake. I wasn't naive. These were petty strikes in a longer campaign. But in those days, as I planted one small seed of disruption after another, I felt the psychological momentum shift. The lodge, once a backdrop for their cavalier occupation, began to feel like an ally. The house creaked in the evenings in a way that sounded like understanding, and beneath the surface of inconveniences, I felt the beginning of something inevitable. Their comfort was not an entitlement, and the narrative they had assumed for themselves could be rewritten. One small correction at a time that their occupation would go unchallenged was about to be corrected, in ways they could neither foresee nor forgive. Not gently, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I confronted my sister in the living room, the same space that had once been my sanctuary, now hijacked by her laughter and the clutter of her extended family. "How can you just let them take over like this?" I demanded, voice trembling but sharp. She looked at me with a tilt of her head, eyes wide as if she hadn't considered the weight of what she was doing. "I'm not taking sides," she said lightly, but the words landed like a punch. It wasn't neutrality, it was complicity. My heart sank as I realized she had chosen them over me, over my rights, over the place I'd built as my refuge. Every old memory of favoritism, neglect, and overlooked effort surged back. The birthday parties she'd monopolized, the accolades I'd quietly earned while she soaked in attention, every past slight compounded in that single moment. I felt a mix of humiliation and betrayal that made my stomach twist. They didn't care I had plans here. They didn't care that this lodge represented my hard work and my sanctuary. My sister's easy acceptance of their intrusion screamed volumes about where her loyalty truly lay. A part of me screamed that family should mean protection, not an alliance against me. But another part, the part hardened by years of being overlooked, recognized the pattern. I had been invisible too many times before, and this was just the latest chapter. I tried to measure my words, to keep my tone calm, but the truth spilled out anyway. "You're supposed to be my sister," I said, voice cracking. "And yet, here you are, letting them walk all over me. Don't you see how unfair this is?" She shrugged and smiled faintly, a practiced mask of innocence, and it fueled the fire inside me. My mind raced through all the times I had bent for others, the countless sacrifices I had made that were always unnoticed, always minimized. The isolation felt suffocating. It wasn't just the lodge they had taken. It was the recognition I deserved, the validation I had been denied. I sank into the armchair, hands gripping the cushions, heart pounding, as the enormity of the betrayal settled over me. They were laughing in the kitchen, oblivious, or perhaps intentionally ignorant, and the sting of their audacity was sharp and raw. My sister's choice, siding with them, confirmed that nothing in this family came without compromise, manipulation, or self-interest. And yet, somewhere under the hurt, a slow, dangerous clarity began to form. If I wanted justice, I couldn't rely on anyone else. I had to reclaim what was mine, my space, my dignity, my narrative. They had underestimated me, dismissed my presence, and ignored my boundaries, and that miscalculation would be the first step in their undoing. The days that followed felt like living in someone else's world, a world where my presence was invisible, and their arrogance was the law. They hosted impromptu gatherings in my living room, filling the air with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses, as if the lodge had always belonged to them. My sister pranced around, effortlessly charming her in-laws, while her husband flaunted expensive gadgets he'd brought along, leaving subtle reminders that I could never match their wealth or status. I watched from the sidelines, my hands clenched, my jaw tight, feeling the sharp edge of humiliation, cut deeper with every toast they made in celebration of their stay. It wasn't just the parties or the material displays, it was the constant belittling of what I had done to maintain the lodge, the quiet sacrifices no one acknowledged, my efforts to keep the place pristine, the evenings I spent alone tending to repairs, all dismissed with sarcastic remarks or eye rolls. "Oh, did you fix that yourself? How quaint," her brother-in-law sneered one evening, and I felt the sting of every unnoticed labor I'd poured into this home. My sister laughed, a tinkling sound that felt like salt in a wound, as if my frustration were a joke. Every insult, every display of entitlement, fueled my outrage and sharpened the contrast between them and me. They flaunted luxury, I endured invisibility. They claimed recognition, I bore neglect. They were loud and celebrated, I was silent and overlooked. My thoughts churned in a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could they be so blind to the pain they caused? How could my own sister not see the audacity, not feel the injustice of the life I had built being occupied by people with no claim, no gratitude, and no boundaries. Yet beneath the fury, a cold clarity began to form. Their overconfidence, their careless arrogance were cracks I could exploit. Every boast, every insult, every misplaced laugh was a clue, a weakness they left exposed. I made mental notes, cataloging their behaviors, the times they overstepped, the ways they sought attention and validation at my expense. The lodge had become a stage for their ego, but it was also a stage I could learn, plan, and eventually reclaim. For the first time since arriving, I felt the stirrings of strategy amid the humiliation. The outrage they provoked wasn't just destructive, it was fuel. I could let it consume me, or I could let it sharpen me. Every sneer, every flaunted gadget, every careless comment became part of a growing dossier in my mind. The anticipation of turning the tables, of reclaiming control and seeing them finally confronted with the consequences of their arrogance, grew stronger with each passing day. The lodge was no longer just my home. It was my battleground, and I was already beginning to map the path to victory. I knew that small inconveniences had rattled them, but rattling was different from exposing. If I wanted to win decisively, I needed proof, something undeniable that showed their intent, their entitlement, and the casual cruelty with which they treated my home. So I began to document everything, not for malice but for accountability. It felt strange at first, to hover with a phone in my pocket while family arguments swelled in the next room, but necessity outweighed discomfort. I learned their rhythms well, who spoke loudly enough to be heard in the hallway, who left notes on counters, who carried paperwork without thinking. That predictability made the work practical rather than voyeuristic. The first piece of evidence arrived unexpectedly. My sister, alone in the sunroom, complained to her husband about how easy it had been to take over, laughing about how I never came up here anymore. She didn't know I was recording. Hearing her voice, so casual and dismissive about occupying what was mine, tightened something in my chest. I kept that clip, a time-stamped proof of complicity. Later, I recorded a heated exchange where her husband sneered at my renovations and called my careful budgeting quaint, as if my sacrifices were some sentimental joke. Those snippets felt ugly to hold, but they were real. I also photographed the physical trail. Receipts with my address used for deliveries, boxes labeled for them left in storage, invitations printed with my lodge listed as the venue, and a draft flyer where they had already branded the place as our retreat. In the study, I found a folder with notes, guest lists, event budgets, and a sketch for an online fundraiser that implied the lodge was now theirs to monetize. Their carelessness became evidence, a paper trail of entitlement that could not be argued away. The more I documented, the less plausible their "we're just visiting" story seemed. There were digital breadcrumbs, too. I scrolled through an unlocked tablet and found messages where my sister casually suggested I let it go if I wanted peace, implying that conflict would be my own fault. Her husband texted a friend boasting about taking over his sister-in-law's mountain place with a string of laughing emojis. Each message stung, but together they formed an undeniable pattern. The cumulative effect of voice, image, and text began to stiffen my resolve. I was gathering a dossier, not ammunition for cruelty but for truth. I kept legal lines in mind. I avoided anything that could be construed as entrapment. I recorded conversations in which I was present, documented sightings and deliveries, and asked for written statements from neighbors who had noticed new mail and unfamiliar cars. The delivery driver I'd previously redirected agreed to confirm the reroute over the phone when I explained the situation carefully and without accusation. A neighbor, who had once been friendly with my late father, remembered seeing boxes and a repeated stream of visitors at odd hours. Little confirmations added up. Collecting proof changed the tenor of my days. Where humiliation had once left me stunned and reactive, documentation made me methodical and forward-looking. I no longer felt like a victim drifting through someone else's narrative. I was building a counter-narrative anchored in fact. The lodge, a place of memories and solitude, became a repository of truth I could present to anyone who doubted me. There was a strange intimacy to the work. Listening back to my sister's voice felt like eavesdropping on the hidden corridors of our family. And it hurt. but the hurt had a purpose. I pictured the moment of unveiling, the quiet satisfaction of laying the files down on the table while watching their comfortable composure fracture under the weight of evidence. I imagined their faces when they realized that arrogance leaves tracks, that entitlement can be traced and documented. That image steadied me. What felt like patience. Like a slow-acting remedy that would reveal truth at the right moment. My hands trembled sometimes, but my purpose did not. I was ready to expose them to the daylight of accountability. They would finally understand me. I chose the afternoon everyone had circled as the family welcome weekend to call them out, because theatrics are useless without timing. They had treated the lodge like a prize to be flaunted, assuming my silence was consent. I waited until the house was full, guests clustered on the deck, voices blending into low music. And then I stepped into the center of the room with the folder I had assembled cradled against my chest. The air tightened the way it does before a storm. People looked up, glasses paused midair. I could feel their curiosity sharpen into attention like a blade. For a moment my sister's eyes met mine, and I watched the practiced indifference crack. I began quietly, because there is power in calm. "I love this place," I said, the words a simple preface to what would follow. It was my escape. I didn't expect to have to fight for it. I set the folder down on the coffee table and opened it slowly, letting the rustle of paper occupy the space between sentences. My voice didn't shake. My insides did, but I kept them tight. I played the recordings first, not to humiliate, but to let truth speak. My sister's casual laughter, admitting they had simply moved in, echoed across the room in a cold, undeniable loop. Then came the clip of her husband sneering at my careful budgeting, calling it quaint. I watched faces shift as the sound landed, some flushed with embarrassment, some rigid with anger, others pretended distraction with narrowed eyes. Next, I laid out the physical trail. Photographs of deliveries addressed to them at my lodge. Receipts. A mock flyer branding my place as their retreat. I described the folder I'd found in the study. Guest lists, event budgets, plans to monetize the space. I watched their composure erode notch by notch. My sister's hands trembled at the edge of the couch. Her husband tried to laugh it off and failed. The in-laws lowered their heads, speechless for once. When I spoke about the neighbor who had confirmed unfamiliar cars and a delivery driver who remembered redirecting packages, the room went quieter. Guilt settled like dust across the furniture. Their bravado had been brittle, propped up by the assumption that no one would challenge them. That assumption had a geological simplicity. It was the kind of arrogance that fractures under pressure. I did not seek dramatic revenge at that moment. I set out a clear, measured demand. Leave. You must vacate, I said, and then I added the weight of preparation. I have documented everything, and my lawyer is prepared to act. Legal language landed differently than grief. It was the architecture of consequence. For a breath, there was stunned silence, the kind that smells faintly of defeat. My sister opened her mouth and closed it again. Her husband's face flushed. He barked a challenge about family, about tradition, as if volume could reverse facts. But the room had already shifted. The guests who had laughed at their jokes were watching with new eyes. A cousin who had once cheered them on cleared his throat and suggested we handle it more formally. That quiet endorsement was a blow sharper than any insult. My sister tried to plea, "Can't we just talk this out?" A line polished for optics. I thought of the recorded messages where she had shrugged about my presence, and I felt no softness for theatrical sorrow. Instead, I offered a narrow, humane window. Vacate within 48 hours with dignity. Avoid messy litigation. Spare the family further humiliation. Her husband's ego pushed back. He muttered about lawyers and property rights, but his threats echoed hollow in a room that now had paper, recordings, and witnesses. Their options shrank to two: stay and litigate against a stack of carefully documented facts, or leave with something of their pride intact. They argued in low, sharp tones, shuffling papers and rechecking phones. I watched the arithmetic of their decisions play across their faces, calculation replacing bluster. Over the next day, the exodus was messy, not the grand departure they had envisioned. Boxes were shoved into cars, laughing forced into brittle jokes, the swagger replaced by a cramped, hurried dignity. They left with muttered insults and attempts at blame, measuring what to say next. I let them go. When the last car turned down the gravel drive, the lodge exhaled, and the silence was the kind that belongs to survivors. Sitting alone in the stillness, the folder on my lap felt less like a weapon and more like a ledger, a record that this had happened and that I had confronted it. The victory did not erase years of being overlooked, nor did it heal the hole that favoritism had gouged in my confidence, but it restored the one thing they had tried to claim, a space that belonged to me. The lodge was mine again, altered and scarred, honest in ways the pretended comfort never was. I let myself feel relief, then a steady, cautious hope. This confrontation had been public and final enough to change how they thought of me. Whether it changed them was another story, but for now, the mountain air felt like permission to breathe. I placed the folder in a drawer and closed it, the click of the latch sounding like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, necessary sentence. The lodge felt impossibly quiet once the last car disappeared down the gravel drive. I walked through the rooms, my fingers brushing over surfaces that had been tainted by their presence, but were now mine again. The echoes of laughter, arguments, and entitlement lingered faintly, like ghosts, but they no longer had power. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without tension clawing at my chest, and I realized how deeply their intrusion had unsettled me, not just physically, but emotionally. It had forced me to confront old wounds, to face the resentment and neglect that had accumulated over decades, and to understand how much I had endured without acknowledgement. Sitting in the sunroom, I allowed myself to reflect. Every strategic observation, every small act of disruption, and every piece of evidence collected had built toward this moment. The satisfaction wasn't in humiliation for its own sake. It was in justice being recognized, in entitlement being challenged, in dignity being restored. The lodge, scarred by their occupation, now held the story of my resilience and patience, a silent testament to how wrong assumptions of superiority could crumble under calm determination. I thought about the hours of planning, the quiet strategies and the restraint I had exercised. I had felt powerless when I first discovered them, humiliated when they dismissed my claims, and enraged at the casual arrogance of their behavior. But that powerlessness had been temporary, and it had forced me to act not out of impulse, but with clarity and intent. The lodge had been my sanctuary before, and now it was my triumph. Looking out the windows at the mountain peaks bathed in late afternoon light, I felt a sense of closure. This was more than reclaiming a home. It was reclaiming confidence, agency, and voice. I had faced betrayal, navigated manipulation, and asserted boundaries with precision. The lodge, silent and still now, seemed to acknowledge it, its familiar creaks and shadows welcoming me back as the rightful occupant. I allowed myself a quiet smile. The journey had been painful, exhausting, and illuminating. Justice had been served not with theatrics or malice, but through careful planning, evidence, and resolve. I was not just the owner of the lodge. I was the author of its peace, the guardian of its stories, and the arbiter of its sanctuary. For the first time in years, I felt entirely seen, not by my family, but by myself. Alone in the lodge, I let the silence settle around me like a soft blanket. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke, and for the first time in weeks, I could feel the tension in my shoulders unwind. It was a solitude I had longed for, the quiet that had originally drawn me here. But now it felt different, earned, hard-won, and layered with understanding. I walked through the rooms, each one holding memories both old and recent, aware that the walls had witnessed not just intrusion, but resilience, planning, and eventual vindication. As comforting as the silence was, I couldn't ignore the complicated emotions that lingered. My family had hurt me deeply, and the betrayals, favoritism, and neglect weren't magically erased. Yet there was a subtle clarity in acknowledging the complexity of those bonds. They were family, flawed and self-serving as they had been, and that reality didn't absolve them, but helped me reconcile the lingering pain. I felt empathy, not for their entitlement, but for their insecurities, the patterns that shaped them, and the ways they would carry these behaviors forward. Recognizing that helped soften some of the sting, transforming raw anger into calm reflection. Sitting by the window, I allowed myself to feel satisfaction and justice served. The lodge was mine, reclaimed not through impulse but through strategy, evidence, and patience. Their arrogance had crumbled under the weight of truth, and I had stood firm without sacrificing my integrity. That triumph carried a deep moral resonance. Wrongdoing confronted, boundaries asserted, and respect regained. The lessons of the journey, the importance of self-advocacy, resilience, and careful observation, settled into me, grounding a sense of emotional closure. I sipped a cup of tea, the warmth spreading through me, and thought of the future. I could maintain this space as my sanctuary, free from intrusion and filled with the quiet I had longed for. Yet I also acknowledged the lingering complexity. The family I loved could still hurt me, and some relationships might never fully recover. That reality did not diminish the satisfaction of today. It merely underscored the balance between justice and compassion, between standing firm and letting go. The mountains outside seemed still, eternal, as if bearing witness to my journey. I felt a soft pride in having navigated the storm, reclaimed what was mine, and emerged not bitter, but wiser, stronger, and fully in control of my space and story. Solitude was no longer just a relief. It was affirmation, a moment of clarity and moral vindication, the perfect conclusion to a chapter of betrayal, strategy, and resilience. Sitting quietly in my favorite chair, I let the events of the past weeks replay in my mind. Every insult, every dismissal, every act of entitlement my sister and her family had displayed had once made me feel powerless. But now, reflecting on how I had handled it, I recognized a profound shift. I had acted with intention, patience, and strategy, transforming humiliation into leverage and reclaiming not just the lodge, but my dignity. The lodge itself became a symbol, proof that careful observation, resilience, and decisiveness could turn injustice into empowerment. I thought about the lessons I had learned. Boundaries were not optional, and self-respect was non-negotiable. I realized that enduring mistreatment silently only perpetuated the imbalance, but asserting myself firmly and ethically restored equilibrium. Each recorded conversation, each documented delivery, each subtle disruption of their comfort had been a small act of reclaiming control, and together they had led to undeniable justice. I felt a quiet thrill at the realization that karma had played its part. Arrogance, entitlement, and disrespect had been met with consequences they could not ignore. There was satisfaction in seeing the emotional and social balance restored. Their departure had not been just physical but symbolic. The lodge, my efforts, and my presence were finally respected. I felt stronger, more capable, and more aware of my own worth. The experience underscored a powerful truth. Justice is not always immediate, but careful planning, integrity, and courage can tip the scales. I had endured betrayal and humiliation, but I had emerged victorious without losing myself. The catharsis settled like a warm glow inside me, a recognition that emotional justice can be deeply satisfying when wielded thoughtfully. I understood that empowerment comes not from retaliation alone, but from measured action that reclaims one's space, voice, and agency. I allowed myself to savor the clarity, the quiet moral balance, and the renewed confidence that had taken root. The lodge, peaceful once more, stood as a reminder. I had faced injustice, navigated manipulation, and emerged not only victorious but self-respecting, validated, and finally free of the weight of others' entitlement. Even as I sank into the quiet of the lodge, a part of me remained alert. Victory felt complete, yet the edges of the story were frayed, reminders that family dynamics rarely resolve perfectly. I noticed small things, a misplaced photo, a note left in a drawer, a voicemail I hadn't yet listened to. Each one hinted that the world beyond these walls still held questions, unfinished conversations, and subtle sparks that could ignite future conflict. I smiled faintly at the thought. Justice had been served today, but life, like family, rarely offers neat conclusions. I reflected on how easy it would have been to believe the story was finished, to close the chapter and move on. But the lodge, with its history and memories, carried reminders that certain patterns linger. Even my sister's departure left traces, the echo of entitlement, faint reminders of who they were and what they thought they could claim. Those traces weren't threatening, but they were provocations, gentle nudges to remain vigilant, to recognize that peace sometimes comes with an undercurrent of anticipation. Thinking aloud, I considered the future with cautious curiosity. Would they return? Would new twists emerge? My mind wandered to small, hypothetical scenarios, guests arriving with tales of attempted intrusion, forgotten commitments, subtle provocations meant to test my boundaries. The possibilities were endless, and the uncertainty was strangely comforting. It reminded me that the story, while satisfying in its climax, had threads that could be pulled again, sparking engagement, discussion, and even reflection for anyone who had lived through similar family drama. In that quiet, I realized the emotional impact of my journey wasn't just in reclaiming the lodge or asserting my rights. It was in recognizing that life and family rarely offer full closure. There is always room for conversation, for surprise, for growth, and for new lessons. By leaving the story slightly open-ended, I felt a connection to viewers who might comment, share, or revisit the narrative to catch nuances they had missed. It was a reminder that even after triumph, vigilance, wisdom, and self-respect remain the most powerful allies. The lodge remained peaceful for now, but I knew the winds of family drama could shift at any moment. And while I relished this calm, I allowed myself the thrill of anticipation, subtle, patient, and potent, that hinted. The story wasn't entirely over, and the next chapter might be just around the corner.